Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. My name is Stuart Teicher. Today, we have an interesting story. I started this podcast episode, the research for this podcast episode. I was working on the story of a lawyer who turned whistleblower. But the research that I was doing took me off in a little bit of a different direction, and I started getting hooked into a completely different story about whistleblowers who weren't lawyers, and I just could not stop researching it. So today's program is an interesting story about some courageous whistleblowers, but there isn't actually any lawyer involved. But it's a good story about corruption and international intrigue nonetheless. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode of the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast. Please don't forget to write a review on your podcast platform of choice, to give us a rating, that sort of thing. It really does help us tremendously to advance, with the algorithms so that more people can see the podcast. Okay, so here we go. Enjoy this tale of whistleblowers, crime, and corruption. The young woman wiped off her arm with an alcohol swab. She grabbed the syringe, stuck it into a vial, and drew out the contents of the vial by pulling back on the plunger. The effort had to be done slowly and carefully because the drug in the vial was so fragile that she had to avoid shaking the vial. With the syringe now full, she wrapped a rubber tube around her bicep, acting like a tourniquet to make the vein in her arm more prominent so it would be easier to puncture. She inserted the needle at a low angle, just as she was taught by her pusher. As the needle entered the vein, a flash of blood appeared in the syringe, and that confirmed that she hit the vein properly. She slowly depressed the plunger, emptying the contents of the syringe into her veins. She then released the tourniquet and removed the needle. A drop of blood leaked back out of the injection site, so she covered it with her finger, applying a little pressure to stop the bleeding. She threw the dirty syringe aside. Later, she'd hide it in an old coffee can and throw it away clandestinely when she left the house. For now, however, she sat back, closed her eyes, and let the drug do its magic. For intravenous drug users, the end is often devastating. Far too many hit rock bottom and meet their demise lying in a gutter with a needle stuck out of their arm. Too few people notice what happened to them, and too few people care. The druggies in this story would also hit rock bottom, but while their destruction would be less dramatic, it would be far more publicized. Many people would notice, and a whole lot of people would care. And it would create an incredible international stir that would burden these drug users for the rest of their lives. Kursk is a bland city located in the massive countryside of western Russia. You might recognize the name of that city, Kursk. The reason you might recognize it is because it was in the news a couple of years ago. Well, maybe more than just a couple of years ago. It had a namesake submarine. The vessel, known as the K-141 Kursk, was an Oscar II class submarine, and it was one of Russia's most powerful attack subs that was specifically designed to hunt U.S. aircraft carriers. Unfortunately for its crew, the Kursk sank in 2000 during a naval exercise in the Barents Sea after a catastrophic torpedo explosion occurred on board. All 118 crew members perished. Maybe you didn't hear about that. All right, maybe you recognize the city of Kursk because it was the site of the largest tank battle of World War II. It was. No, you also didn't hear about that? Well, aside from those two events, there's only one other notable thing about the sleepy city of Kursk, and I doubt that you've heard of that either. It was in Kursk on July 3rd, 1986, that Yulia Rusanova was born. Yulia Rusanova had a difficult childhood. Her father beat her. She wasn't surprised by that. Her father was beaten as a child by his parents, and he was an alcoholic. So it was probably to be expected that he'd carry on the family tradition. But even though it was expected, it still pushed Yulia toward a life of despair. And the rest of her childhood, well, it pushed her even further in that direction. Instead of having fun with her friends during free time, Yulia was forced to work in the field with her families picking vegetables. The meaninglessness of it all seemed to be too much for her. She was being held in a corner, and there was no escape. Yulia yearned to do something else, to run freely away from her empty life in Kursk. There was a way for her to do that, but the path would cause her to defy her father. And she didn't know it at the time, but there was a further danger. The path she was staring at was a direct line toward drug use. It seems that Yulia felt that she had no other choice. Her hopeless existence in Kursk pushed her toward that path. And heading down that path did, in fact, produce the expected result. It was only a few short years later, at 19 years old, that Yulia Rusanova took her first illegal drugs. But Yulia wouldn't be shooting up something like heroin, a drug that would have sent her tumbling into an abyss. No, the drugs Yulia took had the opposite effect. That's because Yulia made the decision to run away from her meaningless life. Literally. Instead of spending her free time in the vegetable fields of Kursk, Yulia Rusanova defied her father and started to spend time at an athletic club in Kursk. There, she began to participate in track and field events. Yulia started with the high jump, but quickly realized that her forte was in another event, running. Maybe the sport had a subconscious benefit. The feeling of running could have provided a feeling of escape from her harsh family life. It could have let her feel like she was escaping what had to have felt like a preordained dull existence in dreary Kursk. Whatever the motivation, Yulia ran. And she didn't just like running. Yulia was really good at running. Early on, Yulia focused on the 100-meter and 200-meter events, and it wasn't long before she started racking up the medals. Well, when you are a successful young athlete in the hyper-competitive sporting world of Russia, you are bound to get noticed. That's why it didn't take too long for Yulia's gifts on the track to attract the attention of some powerful but questionable characters. Some shady men began to watch Yulia's success quite intently. They followed her as she switched her focus to the 800-meter race, and they noticed when she became a specialist in that event. They also noticed that she was good and getting better. They surely realized that Yulia was the sort of specimen who could do big things on behalf of Mother Russia. As the men watched from the shadows, they planned their next move. Even though Yulia was excelling, they knew she could go further. That's because those individuals believed there was a missing ingredient to Yulia's training regimen. But they didn't do anything right away. They sat idly by, watching and waiting. They were patient. And it wasn't until Yulia hit a bump in the road that they saw and seized their opening. Advanced athletics can take a toll on a person's body, and when an athlete is operating at that high of a level, small problems have huge consequences. The smallest ailment that would throw the average person only slightly off kilter can have a devastating effect on the performance of a high-functioning athlete. And that's what happened to Yulia Rusanova. After winning a ton of races, Yulia fell ill. She got a chest infection, and it was hampering her ability to compete. For Yulia, this was more of an issue than just not being able to achieve optimum performance. This could destroy her life. If Yulia couldn't run at an elite level, her ticket out of Kursk would be torn to shreds. Something like a chest infection could sideline her for a considerable amount of time, and it could be just enough time for her competitors to get an edge. Yulia Rusanova was very vulnerable. She knew that her entire career and all of her dreams hinged upon being able to recover from the chest infection and get back to top-tier running shape. The men waiting in the shadows, they knew it too. They surely knew that this was their golden opportunity to get Yulia hooked. and that's why they went in for the kill. Some very connected men approached Yulia Rusanova and told her that they had a way to get her back into competition shape. They knew how to get her to improve her health quickly, to get her back on the track, and that when she did get back on the track, she'd be stronger than before. All she had to do was jeopardize everything she worked for and start a regimen of performance-enhancing drugs. Doping? Yulia was shocked. She'd never considered such an act, and she wasn't so sure it was for her. To understand the rest of the story, we need to talk just a little bit about the science of performing-enhancing drugs, or PEDs. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm not a fan of science either. I went to law school because I specifically don't do math or science. But just stay with me because I'm going to explain it super easy like. And you really have to understand it to appreciate the rest of Yulia's story. Oxygen is critical to muscle development. If you want your muscles to grow, you need to get oxygen to those muscles. And if you want your muscles to grow more, you need to get more oxygen to those muscles. Simple, right? Okay, so how does oxygen get to your muscles? It has to do with hemoglobin. That, by the way, is not a costume for Halloween. That's something else. Hemoglobin is a protein that binds to oxygen. The hemoglobin-oxygen combination travels throughout the body inside red blood cells. And when those red blood cells come into contact with your muscles, the oxygen is infused into the muscle, and the magic happens. Healthy muscles grow, and damaged muscles get repaired. The oxygen also helps stave off fatigue in muscles. The oxygen brings more energy, which means that oxidative stress is reduced. Essentially, the muscles get tired slower, and they can work harder. It's all about the oxygen, baby. The whole hemoglobin-oxygen red blood cell thing, that's a normal part of our body's function. The body naturally brings oxygen to your muscles. But imagine if you could get more oxygen to those muscles. Imagine if you could bombard your muscles with oxygen. Then you could make your muscles bigger and stronger than your competitors. And now think about an ideal situation. What if you could have a rush of oxygen-rich blood be infused into your muscles right when you were about to compete? If that could happen, you could drastically reduce the fatigue that you'd feel during, maybe a woman's 800-meter running race. Yeah, that's the sort of effect that runners like Yulia Rusanova needed. If their muscles would fatigue less during a race, they'd have an edge over their competitors. Well, there's a way to make that happen. All you need to do is artificially increase your red blood cell count. That'll bring more oxygen into your bloodstream. It will supercharge your muscles, and then you'll be bigger, stronger, and less fatigued than your competitors. You'll also be kicked out of competition because that's cheating. Think about it. The only way to artificially increase your red blood cell count is to do it artificially. For instance, you can take steroids or something like EPO. I always mess up on saying the technical word for EPO. Erythropoietin? Something like that. We'll call it EPO. It's a hormone that stimulates the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells. Those type of substances are injected in the body to artificially increase red blood cell production. And that sort of artificial manipulation is exactly what you're not allowed to do in athletic competition. The people who called the shots in the Russian running world, they were convinced that Yulia Rusanova had elite runner kind of stuff. They could see it when she raced. They knew she could benefit from taking PEDs. The drugs would help Yulia recover from her chest infection quicker, and if they were administered properly when she was back at full steam, they could put her at the front of the pack of those elite runners. So, when some influential people recommended that Yulia take performance-enhancing drugs to get over her injury, she took their offer seriously. But she had some concerns, and her concerns were exactly the type of concerns you'd think one would have in this sort of situation. The question she was preoccupied with was, Is that permitted? The response she got was likely the stereotypical Russian answer. You shouldn't be asking whether it's permitted. What you should be asking is whether it's common. In Russia, the answer is yes. Yulia's coaches assured her that doping was common in the Russian system. It was just the way things were done. So now, Yulia Rusanova was faced with a dilemma. She could start taking performance-enhancing drugs, and if it was indeed common in the Russian system, then she'd be able to rise through the ranks of the Russian running world. On the other hand, she could do the right thing, the honorable thing, and take the high road. She could stay clean. She could refuse to go down the path of PEDs and keep her integrity intact. The only problem is that in that scenario, one thing was abundantly clear. The high road would be the street that leads her to nowhere. Yulia surely came to the harsh realization that if she didn't dope, her career would be over. If doping was indeed common in the Russian system, as these guys were saying, then everyone she competed against would be on PEDs. And if that were the case, there'd be no way for her to compete with those dirty athletes. They beat her every time. No matter how hard she trained, no matter how many hours she worked on the track, she'd end up logging slower times than all of her competitors in every race. Her career would come to a screeching halt. In that case, instead of being given an invite to international competitions or even the Olympics, Yulia Rusanova would be given a one-way ticket back to Kursk. As Yulia Rusanova contemplated her answer, she considered her future. If she said no to the PEDs, then this time next year, she'd be back in the fields picking vegetables with her father. The first drug Yulia Rusanova took was in 2005, and it was testosterone. And it worked. Yulia recovered, and her running thrived. The drug worked so well that Yulia Rusanova eventually ended up making the Russian national team. By 2007, Yulia was using steroids and sticking a spike into her veins filled with EPO. She was 21 years old, and the drugs were having incredible results on her speed. Her personal record for the 800-meter race improved by a whopping 9 seconds. In the world of elite running, if you're 9 seconds faster than someone else, you might as well have been shot out of a cannon at the starting blocks. Yulia Rusanova was now knee-deep in a system of training and cheating. And it was a system that one man had dedicated his career to taking down. Vitaly Stepanov was an idealistic young man. Not only did he have idealism, but he had passion as well. Those two characteristics would serve him well in his new job. Vitaly was passionate about sport, and he was idealistic about ensuring that there was fair competition in sport. It was for that reason that he took a job with RUSADA, the Russian anti-doping agency. RUSADA was charged with policing Russian national athletics and ensuring that none of the participants were dirty. That's the phrase used to refer to an athlete who's using performance-enhancing drugs. The funny thing is that RUSADA existed because of the actions of its very countrymen. For some time now, the international athletic world has employed a worldwide effort to police the use of performance-enhancing drugs. Years ago, the international athletic organizations instituted pre-race drug tests, largely in response to the widespread use of PDEs among athletes from the former Soviet bloc. The entire anti-doping system exists because of that. And today, things in that industry are far more complicated. That's because, like in every drug war, the good guys catch the bad guys, then the bad guys innovate and figure out a way to get around the policing efforts. And then the good guys figure that out and start to police better, and then the bad guys figure out ways to get around that, and it's just a cycle that continues. To understand what's happening in that regard in the world of running, we have to go back to the science just for a minute. We already talked about how taking drugs that increase red blood cells is the way to increase strength for runners and prevent fatigue. The problem for athletes like runners in particular, though, is a timing issue. If the runner is going to be able to reduce fatigue during a race, then the oxygen-rich blood needs to be in their body at the time of the race. But if you're going to get drug tested before a race, you're going to get caught. So the cheaters came up with a technique to get around that problem. It's called blood doping, and it's a drug test evasion process that starts way before a race. In blood doping, an athlete trains weeks before an event while using steroids or EPO or some combination of red blood cell stimulating drugs. That creates an elevated amount of oxygen in their blood. During that training, and while they have the abnormally high level of oxygen-filled red blood cells in their bloodstream, well, that's when the athlete removes some of their own blood. They literally draw a crap ton of their own blood out of their body and store it. As the race gets closer, the athlete's red blood count reduces down to normal. The policing authorities then engage in their blood tests to monitor that the athletes are clean. But after those testing samples are drawn, and right before the competition, the athlete's stored oxygen-rich blood is reinfused into their body, boosting the athlete's red blood cell count and giving them the oxygen delivery that they need on the day of the race. Well, as you'd imagine, it was just a matter of time until the policing authorities caught on to the whole blood doping thing. And once they did, they had to create a new scheme to catch the cheaters. So today, in addition to pre-race tests, the international athletic organizations also require every athlete to have an athlete biological passport, or an ABP. The ABP is a long-term monitoring tool that's used by anti-doping authorities to track an athlete's biological markers over time. It does that instead of just detecting specific substances on a single test. The way it works is that there's initially a baseline data collection, where an athlete undergoes regular blood and urine tests to establish their normal biological levels. That's followed with ongoing monitoring, and during that time, levels are tracked for abnormal changes. During that time, the authorities aren't directly testing for banned substances. This athlete biological passport, or ABP, it looks for unusual fluctuations in markers like hemoglobin levels and other kinds of stuff that would indicate doping. If significant deviations are found that can't be explained by natural causes like altitude training or illness, well, then it could be ruled as a violation. You never know when these tests are going to come, so you got to make sure that over time you stay clean. This is what Vitaly Stepanov's employer, Rusada, was all about. They are the Russian anti-doping agency, and it was their job to stop the dopers. Vitaly Stepanov was proud to be associated with that cause. He believed in the mission, and just as important, he believed that Rusada was doing its job and that they were making a difference. In 2009, Vitaly Stepanov was attending a race in his capacity as an employee of Rusada. He was working in an information booth handing out pamphlets about the work Rusada was doing. While he was there, he met an interesting woman. It's not clear if Vitaly saw Yulia first or if it were the other way around, but the two eventually struck up a conversation. Sparks started to fly. In August of 2009, Vitaly and Yulia decided to go on a date. The date could not have gone worse. During their date, the conversation inevitably was directed toward their shared vocation. Yulia ran for the teams that Vitaly's employer regulated. Vitaly was proud of the work they did at Rusada. He told his date, "The beautiful thing about these contests was that all of the athletes were clean." Hopefully, Yulia wasn't eating something at the moment she heard those words, because she probably would have choked on her food. "Are you serious?" she asked Vitaly. Vitaly, the idealist, assured her that he was indeed very serious. "What are you talking about?" she exclaimed. "Vitaly, all of those athletes are doping." Vitaly couldn't believe it. It simply couldn't be. His entire career had been dedicated to ensuring that Russian athletics were clean. He believed that Rusada was achieving its goal. He pushed back at Yulia. Surely she had to be mistaken. Unfortunately for Vitaly, not only did Yulia insist that Russian athletes were indeed doping, but she delivered a knockout blow to Vitaly's idealism. All of the athletes are doping, Yulia explained, and Russia helps cover it up. Vitaly was dumbfounded. Unsurprisingly, the two decided that one date was enough. They mutually agreed not to see each other again. By October, they were married. The two simply couldn't stay away from each other. They felt a connection immediately, and even though they knew it was a mistake to create a union between a dirty athlete and an official who was trying to clean up her sport, the attraction was just too great. But as you can imagine, over time, the contradiction created conflict. The pair fought about Yulia's doping. Vitaly was idealistic and wanted to rid the sport of doping. Meanwhile, his wife was rising up through the ranks of her sport by engaging in the exact behavior her husband was committed to eliminate. A clear sign of their rocky relationship was that in a relatively conservative culture like Russia, Yulia kept her maiden name. As their first wedding anniversary approached, their relationship as a couple seemed to be settling down. But in 2010, each of their relationships with their sport would heat up. In 2010, Yulia Rusanova's doping regimen graduated from pills to injections. It started shortly before a big race. Yulia entered the 2010 Russian Summer National Championships, where she would face off against her fellow Russian runners. They were all trying to secure a spot on the Russian national team, which would be competing in the European Championship. Yulia failed to qualify. She lost out at the trial by 0.01 seconds. She was super close, but at that level, 1/100th of a second is all it takes. What was particularly frustrating for Yulia was that she was running dirty. She should have made the team. Problem was, her competitors were also running dirty. But there was something different about the other women. She felt that the dirty runners from her Kursk region couldn't keep up with the dirty runners who came out of the Moscow region. She soon found out why. While Yulia lost by such a slim margin, she appeared to have attracted the attention of the head endurance coach for the Russian national team. That coach took Yulia under his wing and eventually introduced her to the man who was the reason that those Moscow runners outperformed all the others. The coach introduced Yulia to Dr. Sergei Portugalov. Dr. Portugalov was the Russian expert in doping elite athletes. Properly doping athletes called for a special combination of knowledge. You needed to have serious medical training, a superior grasp on muscle development, and a high-level understanding about elite athletic training methods. Dr. Sergei Portugalov was one of the few people who possessed all of that, and he was part of a larger machine operating within Russia. The Russian athletic apparatus was, let's just say, dedicated to success. The pursuit of winning on the international stage for the Russians was paramount. And the objective seems to have been to win at all costs. Looking back on the system now, it's apparent that the individuals running Russian athletics were given the license to do whatever was necessary to get those wins. For that reason, there emerged a massive conspiracy among the coaches, doctors, and authorities to both encourage the use of performance-enhancing drugs and to keep the doping secret. That meant that people like Dr. Portugalov took care of people like Yulia Rusanova. Yulia was an athlete who was a contender for medals at the international level. That made her untouchable in the Russian system. She was one of those athletes who was knowingly doping and who would be protected from the drug testing controls. Dr. Portugalov was a key part of that system. He was well versed in prescribing for runners all manner of steroids, human growth hormone, and EPO. He was incredibly knowledgeable in the right way to combine the drugs with the training to maximize that drug's potential. Yulia's coach and Dr. Portugalov set up a system of internal doping controls during which he monitored the athletes' blood levels in an effort to ensure that detection was avoided. Dr. Portugalov gave Yulia detailed instructions on what to take and when. He told her how to alter the dosage if her muscles tightened up and how to adjust her training to accommodate the drugs. Just as an example, Yulia recalled that she was preparing to compete in a 600-meter race at the Russian winter meet in Moscow. She met with Dr. Portugalov, who told her to do 3 injections of testosterone, each measuring 1/2 ampule before the race. She thought it was too much, but she listened to what the doctor ordered, and she did as she was told. The doctor's direction was right on the mark. She nearly set a world record at that race. The doctor then directed her post-race process, telling her that later that evening she should do 1 ampule of testosterone and not do any other hard workouts for 3 days to avoid tearing her muscles. For advice like that, Dr. Portugalov was paid handsomely. After each meeting with the doctor, Yulia paid him in cash. And if she went on to win her races, there were more payments. If Yulia won medals at the European or World Championships, for instance, she owed the doctor an additional $1,600 for gold, $1,000 for silver, and $700 for bronze. It was basically a conspiracy. Russian coaches worked with the doctors who together advised athletes. Members of the system coordinated anti-detection. And unfortunately for Vitaly Stepanov, the agency that was charged with policing it all, his employer, Rusada, they were a sham. And because of that, the cover-up was easy. Well, it was easy when the athletes were running in Russia. For instance, Yulia was once competing in Russia for a place on the team that would represent the country in the European Championships. Yulia won her 800-meter race, and she was, of course, consistently doping at the time. After the race, she was tested by Rusada. She entered the doping station, she was assigned a number, samples were taken, she was given a pink paper receipt memorializing what had been done, and she was on her way. Then, immediately after leaving the doping control station, she sent a text message to Dr. Portugalov letting him know the numbers of the samples that she had given. When the results were provided, Yulia's sample was clean. In other instances outside the country, it wasn't so clear how the Russians got the cover-up done. In France once, Yulia gave blood samples for her blood passport, that APB. The results were abnormal. She figured that she'd be in trouble and subject to sanctions, but instead, for some reason, she was allowed to continue to compete. Well, whatever the coaches and doctors were doing behind the scenes, it was working. Yulia continued to do whatever her coaches and doctors told her to do, and she was doing quite well. In 2010, it all got too much for Yulia's husband, Vitaly Stepanov. Years of working in a system that didn't want to face its own corruption had taken its toll. Vitaly Stepanov decided he'd had enough of dirty Russian running. And as the world celebrated the Winter Olympics in Vancouver in February of 2010, Vitaly contacted the World Anti-Doping Agency to blow the whistle on the Russian athletic system. Vitaly met privately with WADA officials, that's the acronym for the World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, and he told them that doping was a systemic problem in Russian athletics. He told them that the situation was worse than he ever could have imagined. He explained it all. He said that Rusada was complicit in all of this because they basically looked the other way. He detailed the bribery that was endemic. He talked about the cover-ups that allowed the entire system to perpetuate. And Vitaly must have been devastated when he got WADA's response. The World Anti-Doping Agency, the entity that's supposed to police anti-doping, said they had no investigative powers, and the complaint went nowhere. So now what was he supposed to do? Vitaly tried to tell someone, and he was rebuffed. So what was next? Should he quit his job at Rusada? Should he demand that his wife quit running? Then what? Then you have two unemployed people who have skills that are applicable to only one industry, the athletic world. A world, incidentally, which they both would have just abandoned. It seemed crazy to quit. But it seemed equally crazy not to quit. So, Yulia and Vitaly chose the crazy option. Vitaly and Yulia stayed at their jobs and lived a life of contradiction. Vitaly spent his days trying to rid the Russian sporting world of performance-enhancing drugs. He kept the pressure on WADA consistently, sending them constant emails and gathering more and more evidence about the reality of Russian athletics. And while Vitaly spent his days trying to expose the corrupt Russian doping system, his wife spent her days using the dope they provided. Over the next year, Vitaly flooded WADA with complaints, and Yulia flooded her veins with the drugs while under the care of Dr. Portugalov. At home, the crazy situation wreaked havoc on their marriage. Many times they were on the precipice of divorce, only to pull back and push forward together. On the track, Yulia made incredible gains. Dr. Portugalov monitored both her drug intake and work regimens intently. She trained hard and competed in Russian national events where she could run dirty without any fear of reprisal. She was so successful during that time that she came close to breaking world records. But as Yulia climbed up the ranks of the running world, Vitaly fell out of the employment world. The employee-turned-activist was fired from Rusada on March 1st, 2011. Getting fired didn't stop Vitaly Stepanov. Over the next years, he sent more than 200 emails and 50 letters to WADA, continuing to advocate against Russian doping. But all the noise that Vitaly was making came back to bite his wife in the behind. In February of 2012, Dr. Portugalov abruptly stopped training Yulia. That's because he learned about what her husband was doing. Portugalov apparently knew that Vitaly once worked for Rusada, and that didn't seem to concern him. After all, who cares if someone was a former employee of an anti-doping agency that was committed to doing absolutely nothing about actually stopping doping? But truly trying to stop doping? Well, that was something entirely different. When Dr. Portugalov found out that Yulia's husband was sincerely dedicated to the mission of eliminating drugs from the system, well, that's apparently when he decided to break ties with the runner. After being dropped by Dr. Portugalov, Yulia seems to have bounced around a bit. The rest of 2012 was a conglomeration of different coaches and different drugs. One coach put her on EPO and steroids. Another coach put her on human growth hormone. Later that year, she was scheduled to begin using oxanabol and primabol tablets. Despite the different faces on her coaching staff and the variety of different drugs coursing through her system, the Yulia Rusanova team was finding a way to make it work. Her running career was trucking along, and it was clear that it was because the Russian system was protecting her. According to Yulia, her coach would change dates on documents. He'd arrange for Yulia to be tipped off about the dates of anti-doping tests, that sort of thing. And it seems that the coaches were working behind the scenes with Rusada to make it all work. Until something strange happened. Yulia was told that there was a problem with one of her testing results. She was flagged for a problem on her athlete biological passport, and it was bad. Word on the street was that Yulia was going to be suspended for 2 years. It seems that even her coach was caught off guard by the results, and that's strange. How could that happen? Yulia was someone who was considered an untouchable elite athlete within the Russian system. She had a coach who seemed to be deeply embedded in the doping system. How does someone so protected, out of nowhere, get flagged for a doping violation? Yulia's husband, Vitaly, well, he thought he knew. He thought it was a setup. Vitaly believed that his wife was being used as a pawn to show the world that the Russians were actually doing something. But why her? Out of all the athletes in the system, why Yulia Rusanova? Well, isn't it convenient that this would all happen right around the time that Dr. Portugalov dropped the runner from his roster of athletes? And the person he dropped just happened to be married to the biggest thorn in the side of the anti-doping world. It was clear to the couple that Yulia was being made a scapegoat, and the consequences had the potential to destroy their lives. The crisis caused the friction that already existed in their marriage to heat up. It also caused tension because Vitaly and Yulia were now facing a financial disaster. The pair relied on Yulia's earnings from running to live their lives. If she were suspended for 2 years, that means she wouldn't receive her salary for 2 years. They couldn't afford to lose that money. Yulia's coach told her that there was one way for her to save her salary. She'd have to do something that she really didn't want to do. It was an intimate act that might be the only way to save the pair financially. And if she did it, it would change her life, and it would change the relationship she had with her partner, Vitaly. Yulia Rusanova had to get pregnant. Under Russian law, a pregnant woman or a woman with a small child couldn't be fired. So even though Yulia wouldn't be able to compete, she'd still be entitled to receive her salary. But in order for this to work, she had to get pregnant quick. She had to be with child before the sanctions were imposed. Well, luckily, Yulia the runner seems to do everything fast, and she became pregnant almost immediately. Yulia announced the pregnancy, changed her last name to Stepanova, which is the feminine version of her husband's surname, and soon gave birth to their son, Robert. While the birth of the baby was surely a joy, the circumstances Yulia and Vitaly were facing were upsetting. She once said, quote, "When I found out about being sanctioned, the world that I imagined to myself collapsed in front of my eyes. And it was very bitter to understand that I'm being sanctioned and the people that set up the doping system in Russia, well, they won't be punished at all. And they'll continue to prepare athletes the same way." The feeling of betrayal changed Yulia. It created a wedge between Yulia and her sport. But interestingly, it brought her closer together with her husband. Yulia started to look at Vitaly's longtime efforts to expose the sport in a little bit of a different way. She began to empathize with his cause, and that empathy actually brought the couple closer together relationship-wise. As Yulia contemplated her future and considered the way her countrymen in sport had thrown her under the bus, she knew it was time for a change. Yulia knew that it was time for her to follow in the footsteps of her courageous partner. It was time to go rogue. Yulia Rusanova, now Yulia Stepanova, decided to become a whistleblower. If a whistleblower is going to be successful, they need evidence. So Yulia set out to get some. She had a myriad of opportunities to do so, given the depths of her involvement in all aspects of the Russian doping system. What Yulia did was start to record conversations she had with all different kinds of people involved in Russian athletics. She set out to create a catalog of evidence that could be used to take down the system that hurt her. Yulia made secret audio recordings of a meeting she had with her coach where he explained that they were trying to get to the bottom of the abnormal ABP result and that he assured her that they wouldn't get caught off guard again. There was another call she recorded where her coach admitted to being in contact with RUSADA and other doping control officials. She also recorded the coach tipping her off about another upcoming test. She then recorded a call with an official who also tipped her off about that upcoming test. Yulia then recorded conversations between her and other athletes, where the other athletes talked about doping. One athlete told Yulia about the course of hormone pills she was taking before a race, and the athlete explained how she strategically took the pills at certain times to avoid detection. Yulia also recorded a conversation between her and a former Russian Olympic gold medalist in the other athlete's home. They discussed how the athlete's coach was doling out liquid-based hormones for runners. The medalist even confessed that everyone was on, as she put it, pharma. She said the athletes knew it was all bad for their health, but that the downside was limited because, as she described it, no one was taking horse-sized doses. As Yulia's punishment period neared an end, she started to train again. She met with coaches and recorded conversations where they provided her with hormone pills and gave her specific directions about when to take them and how to avoid a positive doping control. While Yulia gathered evidence about the realities of the Russian athletic system, her husband Vitaly continued to push WADA, the World Anti-Doping Agency, hoping that they'd eventually do something. The problem was, they couldn't do anything. The World Anti-Doping Agency left enforcement in the hands of the local Russian anti-doping agency, RUSADA, and RUSADA was in the pocket of the bad guys. Vitaly's years of pressuring WADA eventually paid off. WADA's chief investigator, a man by the name of Jack Robertson, finally had enough. It seems he came to the conclusion that the only way to make change was to get the press involved. So Robertson got permission from his boss, and he reached out to a guy named Hajo Seppelt, a German journalist who had previously reported on doping in East Germany and other countries. Robertson put the journalist in touch with Vitaly Stepanov. Yulia, Vitaly, and the journalist Hajo Seppelt were a dangerous combination. Now you had an athlete with hard evidence of doping, a former employee of the anti-doping agency who was privy to the corruption in the system, and an outlet to release that information to the public. Seppelt knew that this story was perfect for a documentary. So Yulia and Vitaly told the German reporter everything, and Hajo Seppelt went to work writing a film. November 23rd, 2014 was a day in Moscow that could have come out of a 1980s espionage film. It was cold and it was rainy. The city felt damp and gray, the type of atmosphere that Hollywood would dream up for a dangerous scene in a Cold War-era spy movie. Except that this day wasn't a dream for Yulia and Vitaly. The danger that hung over their heads was not created by a Hollywood scriptwriter. It was created by their cooperation with a documentary filmmaker. Hajo Seppelt's movie was scheduled to come out in only 10 days. It would be called Secret Doping: How Russia Makes Its Winners. And the stars of the show would be Yulia and Vitaly Stepanov. Yulia and Vitaly knew what that all meant. They were about to bring down the Russian athletic program. The consequences could be devastating. They must have been scared beyond belief. That's why on this dark, damp day in November of 2014, Yulia and Vitaly were in their car along with their young son, Robert. As Yulia and Vitaly navigated the streets of Moscow, they probably clutched both their son and their cell phones. That's because it was on those phones that they had all of the evidence they'd need to corroborate everything they had told Hajo Seppelt. They had multiple videos and audio recordings that would substantiate everything they said to the World Anti-Doping Agency and everything they told that reporter. They drove through the streets of the Russian capital, most likely watching behind them, just to make sure they weren't followed. No, the documentary had not aired yet, but they knew what the fallout would be once the film was released. And let's face it, who knows? Their involvement could have been leaked. Once the film was released, things were going to get real. There would be a lot of powerful people very angry, and they couldn't risk being in Russia as a result. That's why Yulia, Vitaly, and Robert were getting away. As Vitaly and Yulia's car entered Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow, they probably took one last wistful look at their homeland. There was a good chance they'd never be able to come back again. Shortly thereafter, the family boarded a flight to Prague. As they took off, they might have felt a bit of relief, but they knew that it was only the calm before the storm. For now, however, they had all they needed. They had each other, they had their son, and they had evidence on their phones that would be critical when they landed and asked for asylum. The plan wasn't for Yulia and Vitaly to stay in Prague. That was just a layover as they made their way to Germany. The deal they made with Hajo Seppelt was that in return for being the key source for his documentary, he was going to arrange for their resettlement in his home country. But it wasn't going to be easy. That's because the whirlwind started only days after they arrived in Germany. In December of 2014, the documentary was released, and it shook the international sporting world. The movie revealed Russia's systematic doping, their testing cover-ups, and all of the corruption that goes with it. And as expected, Yulia and Vitaly were indeed stars of the show. The program showed the secret footage Yulia had collected on her cell phone and snuck out of Russia when they fled. The world learned about the state-sponsored doping and the apparatus that was developed to cover up the positive tests. The documentary put a target on Yulia and Vitaly's backs. They were immediately branded traitors by their countrymen. Vladimir Putin called Yulia a Judas. Imagine what it must have been like for Yulia and Vitaly living in Germany during this time. They're trying to keep a low profile. Meanwhile, they had thick Russian accents and no ability to communicate in the country's language. They must have stuck out like a couple of sore thumbs. And all the while, they're constantly looking over their shoulder, waiting for Putin's thugs to catch up with them. They must have been in an absolute constant state of fear. Think about it. You're standing in a grocery store, reading the label on a package of cheese, and you catch a mysterious man standing by himself. Your eyes meet briefly, but you look away. And when you look back, he's gone. You ask yourself, was that a normal encounter with just another shopper, or was that a Russian agent sent to find me? Before you know it, you're suspicious of even the most innocuous interactions with everyday people. Soon, every person on the street looks like a Russian agent. It's a spy novel come to life. Russian athletes weren't the only people who were trashed by the film. It looked terrible for WADA as well. I mean, it makes sense. Here you have WADA, the organization that is charged with eliminating doping in world sport. The mission is in their name. They're actually called the World Anti-Doping Agency. Meanwhile, it's revealed in this bombshell film that one of the most elaborate state-sponsored doping systems in history occurred under their noses, on their watch, and after they were warned about it. Clearly, WADA had to do something if it was going to salvage its reputation. But wait, didn't they claim to Vitaly for years that they couldn't do anything? Well, now they were in a really tough place because all eyes were on them. Apparently, the pressure of international condemnation gave WADA the ability to do something. So, like typical cowards, they moved into action when they were put into the crosshairs and had no other choice. Just weeks after the film came out, WADA announced that it called for an independent commission headed by a former WADA chief to investigate the claims. It would have been fair for Yulia and Vitaly to be skeptical about the results of that WADA investigation, don't you think? After all, the organization sat idly by for years, despite the mounds of evidence that Vitaly consistently provided to them about the corrupt Russian system. But even though both criticism and skepticism of WADA was warranted, the agency actually rose to the occasion. WADA produced an absolutely damning report. At over 300 pages, the report detailed the entire extent of the Russian doping system. It also revealed the mastermind of the operation, a man named Grigory Rodchenkov. The scheme that was detailed in the WADA report read like a John le Carré novel. Rodchenko explained that athletes were required to submit urine samples for doping checks in tamper-proof containers. However, the Russian intelligence services became involved, and they developed a method where they could open and reseal the so-called tamper-proof containers without leaving any evidence that the container was compromised. After developing that process, they used it during international competitions. At the Sochi Olympics, for example, Russian intelligence operatives broke into the facility that stored those containers. They made a fist-sized hole in the wall of the room where those containers were held, and then operatives passed each individual container through the wall to another team member who replaced the Russian athlete's dirty urine with a clean specimen. They then left the building without a trace. WADA's report was released to the public in November of 2015. Everyone who had anything to do with the scheme was taken down. For instance, once he realized he was exposed, Rodchenko knew his time in Russia was over. He fled immediately and began to participate with further investigations by the authorities. In addition, a month after the report was published, the top 2 executives in RUSADA left the organization. Yes, the agency charged with policing athletic doping in Russia, Vitaly's former employer, it lost its top 2 executives when the agency's founding chairman, Vyacheslav Sinev, and another executive, Nikita Kamayev, both resigned. You can't help but wonder whether Yulia and Vitaly were happy or furious. Vitaly had been forced to work for what was basically a sham entity in RUSADA. On top of that, he'd been blowing a whistle with all of his breath straight in WADA's face for years, but it took an embarrassing documentary to finally get them to act? On the other hand, they could have been happy. It was their work and persistence that finally got WADA to move. And let's face it, who cares if it was because of a documentary? The important thing is that the truth was coming out, right? Well, any pleased feeling that might have been brought about by a sense of vindication, yeah, that was quickly dashed. That's because the Russians were coming. When the world found out about the extent of Russia's cheating, they began the process of bringing down the boom on Russian athletics. It was clear what would happen next: an investigation. The governing bodies of all of the athletic agencies would be taking a deeper look at the Russian system, and after they did that, there was a very real prospect that the Russians would suffer an extensive ban from future competition. But where would the investigators get the information they needed to pursue that ban? From all the people who worked in the system. And basically, that made everyone with knowledge a target. Yulia and Vitaly knew that they were the ones who started all of this, so they slept with one eye open. As long as they could remain hidden, they'd be okay. They could learn the language in Germany, they could learn the local customs, and if they blended in and kept a low profile, they'd be safe. Staying under the radar meant that you needed to check the radar constantly to ensure that you weren't popping up anywhere. For that reason, Yulia surely monitored the news every day, making sure that no one was chirping about her and Vitaly. And then, one day, she saw something that she didn't expect, and it frightened the hell out of her. The World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, was the target of a cyber attack. Someone, yes, someone, hacked into WADA's computer systems and stole all kinds of athletes' records. And the stuff that they took included the location of where Yulia and Vitaly Stepanov were living. Yulia and Vitaly knew that they needed to run again. They had reason for genuine concern because it seemed that the Russians were coming after everyone involved. Remember those Rusada executives who resigned? Well, 2 months after leaving the organization, that former founding chairman, he wound up dead. No information has been released about the circumstances of his death. And less than 2 weeks after his passing, that other former executive, Nikita Kamayev, well, he was at home after a day of cross-country skiing. At one point, he felt a strange pain in his chest. He clutched his chest, doubled over, and died of a heart attack. Mr. Kamayev did not appear to have any pre-existing heart issues. Yulia and Vitaly knew that their future could not be in Germany. They decided to leave for the United States. Vitaly had once been promised a job there, so it made sense that they would head that way, and besides, the country was so big that it might be easier for them to get lost. So, once again, the pair grabbed their son, packed up their bags, and left their home as quietly but as quickly as possible. Russia was indeed slapped by the international sporting community, but not as badly as you'd think. In 2017, the country of Russia was officially banned from the upcoming Winter Olympics, but their clean athletes were allowed to compete as, quote, Olympic athletes from Russia. Their designation was OAR. 168 Russian athletes competed under the OAR banner, and they won some medals, but even that wasn't free of controversy. Curler Alexander Krushelnitsky was caught doping, and he was stripped of his bronze medal. In 2019, WADA accused Russia of manipulating doping tests and tampering with evidence. That year, they banned Russia from major international sporting events for 4 years, including the 2020 Tokyo Olympics and the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. As a result, Russian athletes competed in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics under the ROC label, which stood for Russian Olympic Committee, and they weren't permitted to have their flag or hear their anthem. But an international tribunal, the Court of Arbitration for Sport, well, they reduced Russia's ban to 2 years. I don't know, it doesn't sound to me like they got slapped so hard. Meanwhile, the people who spilled the beans, well, they're still looking over their shoulder. The man who devised and perfected the Russian doping methods, Grigory Rodchenko, well, it's confirmed that he's still alive as recently as February of 2024. But he's currently only alive because he's in the FBI's witness protection program. As for Yulia and Vitaly, the family is somewhere in the United States, living in hiding. The job Vitaly was promised never materialized, and the Stepanovs were actually forced to move 6 or 7 times. Ever the competitor, Yulia Stepanova mounted a running comeback. She applied to run at the Olympics in Rio in 2016. She wanted to do so as an unaffiliated athlete. But it was not to be. The International Olympic Committee turned her down and barred her from competing in the Olympics. Seems a little unfair to me, don't you think? Refusing to give up, Yulia continued to pursue her running dream. She trained in high altitudes with her husband while in hiding in the United States. She was hopeful to be able to show the world that she was still able to perform at an elite level, even without performance-enhancing drugs. Yulia entered the 800-meter event at the European Athletic Championships in Amsterdam, and she competed as a neutral athlete under the European Athletics Association's flag. When Yulia returned to running, it wasn't just her performance on the track that she had to deal with, it was the other competitors as well. Some embraced her, but others hated her because of the doping. Regardless, I'm sure she hoped that the race in Amsterdam would be a moment of triumph for her as she returned to international competition. Yulia took her mark on the starting line of the race in Amsterdam. The starter pistol went off, and she was strong out of the gate. After 200 meters, she was likely feeling like her old self. The months of preparation were surely paying off. As she proceeded down the track at 400 meters, a lifetime of training just had to be evident. The years under the tutelage of Russia's best coaches were certainly showing. But as she reached the 650-meter mark, Yulia winced in pain. She pulled up and began to limp. She must have known instinctively that it was bad. Yulia tore a ligament in her foot. She walked the rest of the race. Today, Yulia and Vitali's son Robert is, I guess, about 11 years old. He's old enough to understand what his parents went through. He's old enough to understand why his parents moved so often. And he's probably old enough to understand why he has to be very careful about revealing too much information about his family's details. Yulia and Vitali seem to have found a stable home in the United States these days, though no one knows where that is. They keep quiet about who they are, and most of their neighbors don't know about their past or what they've done. Their accent would make it clear that they're Russian immigrants, but unless someone happened to see an errant news article about the couple, there's little chance that they know the rest of their story. But Yulia and Vitali know that the Russians will always be looking for them. And while no hiding place is perfect, they feel oddly protected in the United States. Yulia once explained why she felt that way when speaking to one of the few friends who know about her background. She explained, "If they kill us in Russia, the Russians will investigate this case and they'll just say it was an accident. But if they kill us here in America, the Americans will investigate the case and the whole world will know the truth." Pretty good story, right? I mean, I know that it didn't have any lawyers in it, like I said, but once I started researching it, I just couldn't help myself. I'm back on my normal schedule going forward. You'll have the next episode of the Good Lawyers Gone Bad podcast at the first of the month. It's going to be a hot topic in the news, so watch all of the social media platforms for the teasers that I send out shortly. It's Good Lawyers Gone Bad on Instagram as well as Facebook, and we're Lawyers Gone Bad on Twitter, or X. Is that what we call it now? So like and follow on all those different platforms, and please go ahead and rate our podcast and give us a review if you'd like on the podcast platform of your choice. Thank you very much, everybody. It's been my pleasure to talk to you today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.